Thanks very much, Jennifer. I'm really happy to be here and be part of this conference. Jamie is going to be talking, I think, a little bit more about the leaders themselves in this campaign and their branding and their strategies. I'm just going to talk more generally, and you'll have to forgive me if this is something that you've already talked about throughout the days of the conference. I'm going to talk a little more generally about pandemics and campaigns in Canada and sort of things that have changed. We have in Canada had 5 provinces and 1 territory who have held elections during the pandemic. We've also had 2 leadership races during the pandemic. So I think we've probably had, potentially more elections than most places during the height of this crisis. And off the top, what we sort of see when we look at these provincial elections and the 1 territorial election, we'll find out on September 20th for our federal election, is that a trend seems to be certainly lower voter turnout when we compare it to their previous elections. So for a couple of the provinces, for Jamie's province in New Brunswick and in Nova Scotia, turnout was relatively the same from their previous elections. But for the other provinces, turnout has declined by between 5 and 10%. So it's a pretty obvious change if we're just doing a benchmark from no pandemic to pandemic. So when we look at the 6 elections that have happened, just gathering kind of top line information about how a pandemic challenges parties in terms of managing their campaigns. Across the board, what you hear from candidates themselves, from news articles, journalist reports, is that generally reaching out to people in ways that have traditionally happened continually matters in a campaign, right? So those traditional things of rallies, when you have organized barbecues or spaghetti dinners with voters and supporters, we're used to shaking hands, door-to-door canvassing. When that can't happen, candidates and parties are feeling it, right? So in Saskatchewan and certainly New Brunswick, for a certain point, door-to-door canvassing was prohibited. Like, you couldn't talk to anybody in person. And we know from evidence that in-person discussions during a campaign is quite helpful for voter turnout. And so this has a number of effects for parties when they're prohibited from doing these traditional things. First of all, it's a lot harder to get a read on your support, right? So valuable information is often gleaned at the doors, as all of you would know, and parties in Canada and elsewhere have developed digital apps and other digital infrastructure where volunteers can put in their information and send it off to party headquarters, so you have a good idea house to house, who's supporting you, who's not supporting you, who might support you. So that information is harder for parties to get, and I think they're feeling that effect. The other thing that's challenging is volunteer recruitment and management, team building with volunteers, appreciation events. So the things that keep volunteers engaged, keep them coming out. This is also much harder for parties to do when it's virtual, because you don't have that energy from each other, kind of that feeling of working together as a team. It's harder to create those particular effects. As a corollary to that, energizing your leader, your party leader, keeping their spirits up, keep them positive. A lot of that comes from managed events. You've recruited the right supporters, you're in the airport, that's the kind of thing where the speaker will, the leader speaks to a crowd, they get energized from all that support, it keeps their spirits buoyed. That is also missing here. And Jamie maybe we'll touch on this, some of the brand strategies change. So as Alex was saying, Justin Trudeau definitely has done media management. Part of his, I think, cachet for sure in 2015, he was like the selfie prime minister, and he would take pictures with certain demographics, often young people, to convey where he was strategically thinking about getting his support. We don't see, obviously, that so much in this campaign either. So there's a bit of a strain, I think, even on that brand that he's tried very hard to create. So generally reaching out then also leads to get out the vote efforts, which are there's the meat and potatoes of campaigns. So as I said, when door-to-door canvassing is limited, you don't have quite the same good or updated information on potential supporters and voters. And so it's harder to encourage people to come out and vote. The usual strategies that are often employed in Canadian campaigns is parties will go and pick up voters in their minivans and drive them to the polls to make sure they get people out. That's, of course, has been prohibited in many of the provincial campaigns. You're not allowed to carpool with strangers. Mail-in ballots will be an interesting thing. So they've been used a lot in the provincial campaigns, but again, we've seen lower turnout. So trying to ensure that voters know what to do with that mail-in ballot, when they need to mail it by, et cetera, is posing more of a challenge. And also senior residences. So in a number of the provincial campaigns, a lot of senior residents are completely off limits. And if we know anything, we know that the over 65 crowd like to turn out and vote, and has been certainly a targeted population for many parties. So those are, I think, some of the challenges that have come out of the campaigns that we have had over the last 18 months. Pandemic campaigns have also reinforced a few things. So not only is the door-to-door and the, actually talking to people important, but obviously the digital strategies are now something that parties cannot do without. So Canadian parties at both federal and provincial levels have been developing and expanding all the digital tools that they have. Advertising on social media platforms is relatively well honed. It takes up a lot of parties' budgets to do that. But to this point, digital tools have kind of enhanced all those traditional measures, and now they need to replace, they've been replacing those traditional things. So in some cases, things like live Facebook town halls, some of them might actually attract more people than a regular rally might. It's a lower barrier and lower cost to sort of go to those sorts of things. And for some people, they might even feel closer, because even with Zoom and you can change the gallery, you might even feel a little bit closer to the leader if you're attending that. But digital strategies are now key to the campaign because they may have to be used to replace what it is that parties have done. And then I would also add that gaffes, there's an argument or one observation that gaffes can be lowered in a campaign because you're sort of using these online tools. The one thing that still has impact, particularly in a public health crisis, are images where leaders are doing things that violate public health protocols. And we have had that a few times in our Canadian campaigns, where when Aaron O'Toole won the leadership, he was taken with a photo of 32 other people. Only one person was masked. It was a child, fortunately, but all together crowded in for a photo. Just the other day, Justin Trudeau was criticized because he crammed everybody into a small restaurant to do a presser, and it was violating the regulations in that particular restaurant. So even those images actually matter a fair bit when voters are trying to keep themselves adhering to those rules, and we have politicians that are violating them.
You've got 1 minute left.
Okay, 1 minute left. I'll say, I guess, two more things for advantages, things that might be helpful. One, overhead costs to parties. So when we do an examination of where parties have spent their money, I think we'll see a drastic reduction in terms of overhead costs, because you're not renting banquet halls. You don't have to charter planes. Canada's a really big country. Planes cost a lot of money for parties to travel in, which then means we may find that this pandemic has actually potentially leveled the playing field for some parties. So where smaller parties may struggle more to, pay for a plane or get in touch with people, it's possible that the pandemic may have provided them with a slight advantage that they wouldn't have had before. Okay, and I'll leave it at that.